ever feel like you're dropped right in the middle of like a debate and everyone's using these words that are just so loaded?
Right.
It's like you can't even have a
Yeah.
conversation without stepping on a landmine.
Exactly.
Kind of what Edward said is getting at
Right.
in the question of Palestine, right? And like that's what we're diving into today.
It's like you walk into a room and the conversation's already happened.
Yes.
And you're just trying to figure out what language they were even speaking.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the words themselves, right?
Okay.
It's the whole framework. Like how we even begin to understand a place, a people, a conflict.
Yeah.
Calls this Orientalism.
Okay.
And he argues that it's basically been the West's lens for viewing the East for centuries.
Okay. Orientalism. Break that down for me. What does that actually mean? Because it's not like...
Yeah, it's a big word.
It's not an everyday word.
No.
It's not.
So what are we talking about here?
So imagine like a lens, right? But this lens, it's Western made.
Okay.
And Said would argue that it distorts the East.
Okay.
It makes it seem exotic, mysterious, dangerous, even... Think of like the stereotypical images you've seen, Arabian Nights, despotic rulers, things like that.
Yeah, like very romanticized, but also kind of scary at the same time.
Exactly. It's this weird mix.
Yeah.
And Side's point is this isn't just harmless imagery. He's saying this has real-world consequences.
So it's like this pre-existing bias that then colors how everybody interprets like all the other information.
Yes.
So like even if I just say Middle East right now.
Right. Everyone listening already has like a picture in their head. And it's probably shaped by this Orientalism idea.
And those preconceived notions, they make it easier to accept certain narratives about the region.
Okay.
Including the really complicated ones about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, and the thing is, you have to remember, this book comes out in '79.
Okay.
So this is just a little over a decade after the '67 war.
Right.
The Camp David Accords are looming.
Right.
Said is jumping right into the thick of it.
Yeah, he's not writing this from like a detached historical perspective. This is very much current events.
He's in the fire.
Yes.
And he's challenging not just the politics, but like you said, that whole way that we even think about the conflict.
Okay, so we've established this is dense stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot to unpack, and we could do a whole year of deep dives on this book alone. But
easily.
For today, we're really focusing on what I would say is like the heart of the book.
Okay.
Which is the introduction.
Right.
It's like he lays out his whole argument right there.
It's the thesis.
It is. And once you kind of get into his style, the rest of the book really clicks.
Right.
But you got to kind of break through that initial density.
Yeah, you have to know what he's doing.
Exactly.
It's deliberate, you know.
It is. And one of the things he does in that introduction that I found really interesting is this dedication.
Yes.
He dedicates the book to two Palestinians, both with drastically different experiences.
Right.
One exiled in the U.S., the other one actually died in an Arab prison.
Interesting, right.
It's super interesting. I mean, right off the bat, he's telling you this is not some simple us versus them narrative.
Right.
There is nuance even within the Palestinian experience.
Absolutely. And it really speaks to his larger point about the dangers of these monolithic narratives, these oversimplifications. But it's not just about representation. He also takes aim at the academic world.
Okay.
Particularly political science.
Oh, he does not hold back.
He does not mince words.
What does he say?
He basically says they're so focused on the big players,
okay,
the superpowers, right?
Yeah.
That they miss what's happening on the ground.
Right.
With the people who are actually living through the conflict.
The day-to-day reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their predictions fail, he argues, because their whole approach is flawed.
He goes for the jugular.
He does.
I mean, he really does not let them off easy.
No, there's one line where he calls academic political science policy sciences in a worse sense.
Wow.
Because he feels that it's more interested in maintaining power structures than understanding the complexities of human experience.
And, you know, for our listeners out there, this is exactly the kind of insightful nugget that we're looking for in these deep dives.
Absolutely.
It's not just about summarizing a book.
Right.
It's about pulling out those key ideas that really make you stop and think.
That makes you say, I never thought about it that way.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of insightful nuggets, Said goes on to use this really fascinating example from a novel.
Okay.
Called Daniel Deronda.
Daniel Deronda. See, now that one doesn't really ring a bell.
Yeah, it's a bit obscure.
Okay.
It's a 19th century novel.
And the basic plot is this guy who discovers he's Jewish and then becomes a Zionist.
Okay, so far so good.
Right. Sounds pretty straightforward.
I feel like there's a but coming.
Oh, absolutely. There's a but.
Okay.
So Seth points out there are basically no Palestinian characters in this whole novel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's all about like this idea of a Jewish homeland.
Right.
But the people who already live there are basically invisible.
So he's saying even in a story that's supposed to be like drumming up support for Zionism,
right,
Palestinians themselves are silenced.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting point.
It goes back to Orientalism, right?
Okay.
The novel doesn't need Palestinian characters because it's relying on this idea of the East as like this empty canvas.
Right, like it's just waiting for a story.
Exactly. Waiting for like a Western story to be projected onto it.
And that's what he's trying to dismantle, right?
Yes.
Like this whole notion that the West gets to write the narrative of the East.
Exactly. And it's not just literature. He also goes after media coverage of the conflict.
Oh, yeah. He talks about this.
Specifically, what he sees as this double standard when it comes to how terrorism is portrayed.
Right. He's basically saying that like acts of violence committed by Jewish groups were often ignored or downplayed by Western media.
Exactly.
While Palestinian violence was obviously condemned.
And to really hammer this point home, he includes this really chilling quote from General Mordecai Gur, who was the Israeli chief of staff at the time.
This is the one where he's talking about bombing Lebanese villages, right?
Yes. And what's crazy is that he's basically bragging about it.
It's what?
He says, "We struck villages without authorization. This is something that was done dozens of times, but this time we were caught."
It's like he's almost proud of it.
Right. Like it's just business as usual.
Yeah.
And Side's point is that these kinds of actions barely even registered in Western media.
He's not saying they weren't reported. He's just saying it wasn't like...
It wasn't given the same weight.
Yes.
The same level of attention or condemnation.
Right. Like if the roles were reversed, it would be a much bigger deal.
Exactly.
Which again feeds into this whole argument about representation.
Yes.
It's not just about what's being said. It's about what's being left unsaid.
It's about who has the power to control the narrative.
Right. And who gets to decide what we even talk about.
Exactly. And that's what Saidi's sees as so dangerous.
So for our listeners out there, this is where it gets really real.
Right. This isn't just ancient history.
Right.
This is still happening.
This is happening right now, like in all these different ways.
Exactly. Think about the news you read, the documentaries you watch.
Even just like a conversation you have about a really complicated issue.
It's crucial to be aware of those potential biases, those silences.
And that's what makes Said's work so relevant even all these years later.
Absolutely. He gives you the tools to think critically about the information you're consuming.
Yeah.
To question those narratives you've been taught to accept.
Because sometimes the story that's not being told is actually the more important one.
Exactly.
It's like you're suddenly seeing the Matrix, right? And all these like hidden layers of meaning, and you can't unsee it.
Exactly. And the thing is, he ties all of this back to his big argument about self-determination for Palestinians.
Okay.
He's saying, like, real understanding, true justice.
Right.
It can't happen if we don't deal with these biases.
So it's not just about critiquing the West.
No.
It's about, like, making space for a different kind of conversation about this conflict and its history.
Remember that dedication to the two different Palestinians.
The one who was exiled and the one who died in an Arab prison.
Yeah, that's the thing right there.
Right.
That's what he wants us to see.
Yeah.
That complexity, that's the Palestinian experience.
Don't oversimplify it.
Right. Don't make it this little monolith.
Yeah.
There are so many voices, so many stories.
And that's so important, especially with something as, like...
Oh, it's loaded.
Charged, as this conflict is.
It's easy to fall into the black and white thinking.
Totally.
But Said's saying, like, resist that.
Yeah.
Embrace the nuance, the ambiguity.
Question everything.
Question every narrative you're given.
Well said.
Right.
And on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
Definitely.
This has been a real deep dive into Edward Said.
Right into it.
And I hope it's given everyone some new ways to think about this conflict.
Because it's not just about this conflict.
Exactly.
It's about any time you see these power dynamics playing out.
Anytime someone's voice is being silenced.
Exactly. Pay attention to that.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Edward Said's The Question of Palestine.
And hopefully you'll pick up the book and do some exploring of your own.
Always keep learning, right?